Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, it is a pleasure to join you all here today at this Leader Summit organized by the UN Global Compact Network Korea. I'm Griet Katar, Head of Labor Rights at the UN Global Compact Office in New York, and I'm part of the social team working closely together with Julie Kofod, Head of Human Rights, who will also speak today. I would like to thank our local network for inviting me at this important session to discuss the labor market changes and human rights impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic. This pandemic is much more than a health crisis. It is a human, economic, and social crisis with huge impacts on the labor market. Millions of companies worldwide are in danger of being forced out of business with grave impacts on employment. The most recent ILO estimates talk about a 17% loss of working hours globally for the second quarter of 2020, which is equivalent to 495 million full-time jobs. The Republic of Korea was one of the countries to first be affected by COVID-19. While the pandemic has taken a deep toll on the labor market, your country has been on a steady employment recovery. The level of employment, however, is still lower than a year ago, and this is particularly the case for women's employment and vulnerable groups of workers like temporary employees and daily workers. Because of the interconnectedness of the global economy, the crisis has severely created an unprecedented global disruption. Every link in the global supply chain has been disrupted. The harmful effects of this pandemic will not be distributed equally. It will be most damaging for the poorest countries and in the poorest neighborhoods, and for those in already disadvantaged or vulnerable situations. We expect working poverty to increase, especially in countries with high levels of informality or weak social protection systems. We also expect child labor and forced labor to increase for the first time in years. And we expect increased labor rights abuses with heightening risks of those already exploited. The COVID-19 crisis has uncovered the huge decent work deficits that still prevail in 2020. In particular, the vulnerability of millions of working people and the lack of social protection coverage. At the same time, many small businesses are operating in precarious situations and global supply chains are often too weak to be sustainable. For most companies, the health and safety of employees, together with the business continuity and even business survival, are the number one focus of today. It is, however, crucial that we do not lose sight of the need to implement the 2030 Agenda commitments. The Agenda is a roadmap for responses to the economic, employment, and social impacts of the pandemic that will put us on track to resilient and sustainable development that leaves no one behind. This is where the 10 principles of the UN Global Compact on human and labor rights, environment, and anti-corruption, but also together with the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, provide a strong pathway forward for business. Now, more than ever, business can and should play a central role in societal transformation. Business, as usual, is no longer an option. There are significant challenges that define our world today, from declining trust and growing inequalities to fragile trade networks and broken supply chains, to weakening international cooperation and also social cohesion. Each of these challenges present an immense opportunity for business to reinvent. The role of business should continue transforming in contributing to the global sustainable development agenda. Principles and profit should go hand in hand. As UN Global Compact, we will help you to take action, to implement the principles, to make sure your commitments are translated in concrete actions. And I'm inviting you to have a look at our website where you can find a lot of information on what actions you could take to protect human and labor rights and advance decent work for all. And you can learn from other companies on what has worked. We support and encourage our companies to take effective measures to identify, prevent, mitigate, and account for how they address the risks of adverse impacts on labor and human rights in their operations and in their global supply chain. My colleague Julie will tell you more about this. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Griet, and hello everyone. Greetings from New York. My name is Julie Garfield Kofod, and I'm the head of human rights at UN Global Compact. Thank you so much to Global Compact Network Korea for organizing this event. I'm honored to be here with you, with the audience, and with the UN Global Compact signatories to discuss how to navigate labor market changes and human rights impacts in the post-COVID-19 era. These are indeed unprecedented times, and I'm not even sure that we are in fact in a post-COVID era yet, although there does seem to be light at the end of the tunnel. So Greta has already laid out some very sobering numbers around the impacts COVID-19 has had on workers and supply chains, and I'll now be addressing a few of the human rights aspects which warrants attention as well. So first of all, human rights are, of course, front and center to our mission at the UN Global Compact, both in our 10 principles and in the United Nations 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. In the 10 principles, the emphasis on human rights is explicit. The first 6 of our principles are on human rights. And the 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda and its 17 goals is in its entirety built on human rights. The 17 goals have a total of 169 targets, which I'm sure you're aware of, 92% of which are tied to human rights and labor standards. This means that the best way to contribute towards a sustainable future, including in the post-COVID-19 era, is to take human rights action. And since the international normative framework is already in place in the form of the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, we all just have to get started. You have to put in place an ongoing human rights due diligence process to identify, prevent, mitigate, and account for adverse human rights impacts, a responsibility which extends across a company's value chains and business relationships, including your suppliers. This responsibility to respect human rights exists even in times of economic hardship and public health crisis, and regardless of whether and how governments are meeting their own obligations. As Greta alluded to, the human rights due diligence framework as set out in the UN Guiding Principles should be used to guide businesses through the challenges of addressing human rights risks arising from measures taken in response to the COVID-19 crisis. In these times of uncertainty, human rights due diligence is key to allow for adequate preventive measures to address new human rights risks generated by the pandemic and to shape a relevant response, both individually and in collaboration with other stakeholders. Where there's harm to people from measures taken in response to COVID-19, those who have been impacted should have access to effective remedy through legitimate processes. So in short, the responses to the pandemic and the economic impact must not result in lower human rights standards or even be used as a pretext by governments or business actors to circumvent international human rights commitments, as the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights puts it. So building on what Kate has already highlighted, what are some of the additional things to pay particular attention to in a human rights context during and in the post-COVID-19 era? First of all, be prepared to address potential stigma and discrimination in the workplace. COVID-19 is generating a wave of stigma, discrimination, racism, and xenophobia against certain national and ethnic groups. Businesses can push back against this trend, including by supporting the dissemination of accurate, clear, and evidence-based information and awareness-raising campaigns as the most effective tools against discrimination and xenophobia, which feed on misinformation and fear. Secondly, integrate human rights expertise in your crisis management teams to be able to identify and address risks to people that may otherwise be overlooked. Also, pay particular attention to those most vulnerable, including persons with disabilities who may be prevented from working from home due to absence of equipment and support which are available in the workplace, and perhaps face increased risks of losing their income and jobs, as well as LGBTI people, some of which may work in the informal sector and lack access to paid sick leave, unemployment compensation and coverage. Additionally, due to discriminatory paid leave policies perhaps occurring in your supply chains that do not cover all genders equally, LGBTI people may not be able to take time off from work to care for family members. I would also encourage you to promote a strong culture of ethics and integrity to build trust with consumers, employees, investors, suppliers, and other stakeholders by communicating and applying policies in a consistent, inclusive, and transparent manner. And lastly, make use of open and transparent multi-stakeholder dialogue and processes to ensure legitimacy and effectiveness of the practical guidance and initiatives needed to address risks in specific contexts and industries, and meaningful consultations with potentially affected groups and other relevant stakeholders. This is, of course, by all means a non-exhaustive list, and I would encourage the participants to visit our COVID-19 dedicated website, which contains additional resources and suggested action points. So in summing up, let me just say that the health of every person is truly linked to the health of the most marginalized members of the community, and as such, responses to this pandemic and the recovery must encompass those whom society otherwise often neglects or relegates to a lesser status. So with that, I'll end, and I look forward to our continued engagement. Thank you again so much.